And I call the honourable member for McMahon.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Well, a little over 5 years ago, when the intergenerational report was released, the then Shadow Treasurer held a press conference, and he said, "This intergenerational report's got more hot air than the Hindenburg," he said. Well, he was predicting his own report 5 years later. In fact, he was predicting his entire tenure in the Treasury portfolio. More hot air than the Hindenburg. He was predicting his entire reign over the Treasury portfolio. We know, Madam Speaker, that the Australian people, when they think of generational change, are very interested in one generational change. That's a change of government, and a change of government to a government which actually understands the challenges and opportunities in Australia. We know, Madam Speaker, that this document is a gross politicisation of what should be a proper process. We know that this document is one last desperate attempt by the Treasurer to sell his unfair budget. Here we are all these months later. Normally a government would be well into preparing the next budget. They'd be well into preparing the final details of the next budget, and the Treasurer is still flailing around trying to sell the last one and abusing the Charter of Budget Honesty as he does it. He's flailing around with a new narrative every day, a new excuse, a new alibi, a new story, because he can't sell what is a bad product, and that bad product is his handiwork. It's his federal budget. This report tells us quite a lot, Madam Speaker. It tells us a lot about this government. It tells us about their desperation. 45 times this document refers to previous policies. 45 times it refers to previous policies. And what are those previous policies? The previous policies of this Treasurer, as outlined in his mid-year economic outlook. He could have chosen as a starting point the pre-election fiscal outlook, signed off not by me, not by Minister Wong, signed off by the then Secretaries of the Departments of Treasury and Finance, independent of government. I read the PFO when it was released to the public, as I should. It was an independent document, signed off by the Secretaries of those two departments. Did the Treasurer use that as the starting point for his previous policies? No, because that wouldn't be politically convenient. He had to use as the starting point the mid-year economic forecast, which included his own decisions, included his decision to give $9 billion to the Reserve Bank, including his decision to increase spending by $14 billion, including his doubling of the deficit of Australia. That's the fact of the matter. That's the starting point he chose as previous policies. If you're going to engage in using the intergenerational report and the Charter of Budget Honesty to sledge your previous government, at least get your facts right. At least start with a bit of honesty. At least start with a pre-election economic forecast signed off by the Departments of Treasury and Finance. It does tell us a fair bit about this government. We've heard during question time. It tells us what they think about climate change.
It's an economic benefit. It's a nirvana.
Apparently greed is good and climate change is better, Madam Speaker. Some economic effects may be beneficial, where regions become warmer or wetter. This may allow for increased agricultural output. Well, that's a relief. I was worried about climate change before. I think, Madam Speaker, the Minister for Agriculture has not just been changing Hansard, he's been changing the intergenerational report as well, Madam Speaker, as our friend the Minister for Agriculture. And the report talks about the good work that happens in California on climate change, Madam Speaker. Just as well they don't have a cap-and-trade scheme, Madam Speaker. That's just as well. That would be an inconvenient truth. It also tells us what they think about productivity and innovation. Madam Speaker, the report says there is little evidence that slower productivity growth has been the result of inadequate investment in skills, education or innovation more broadly. Well, you wouldn't want to invest in skills, education or innovation to increase productivity, would you? Why would you go and do that? Why would you go and do that? What would innovation have to do with productivity? What a terrible thought. Well, this report's cleared up quite a lot. Quite a lot for me now. We know that climate change is actually good. Innovation's got nothing to do with productivity. Education, why would you invest in that? Well, we know they're not, because we also know that education funding falls dramatically under the scenarios presented as government policy, this government's policy. This government's policy as a percentage of GDP. Let's talk about education funding as a percentage of GDP. I invite the member for Kooyong to comment on what this report says about education funding as a percentage of GDP. He should tell us what it says, because it's not a pretty story. It is not a pretty story. We know that this government has one way of dealing with demographic change, and that is to make people work longer and to give them less in retirement. That is their only answer, Madam Speaker, but of course there are better answers than that. There are better answers than that. 32 years ago today, in Australia, a new government was elected, the Hawke Labor government, Madam Speaker. What a contrast, the Hawke Labor government with their Prime Minister and their Treasurer, who knew that we should invest in the future. He knew how to actually deliver economic reform. He knew how to make the case for economic reform. He knew how to take the Australian people with them on economic reform. He didn't lecture them about lifters and leaners. He said to the Australian people, you know what? You deserve a first-class retirement income system and we'll give it to you, said the Hawke Labor government and the Keating Labor government. We'll give it to you. We'll give you a universal superannuation system, which means every Australian worker should be able to save for retirement through that system. A system Labor built against the opposition at every stage of the Liberal and National parties. Let's not hear about bipartisanship for the Liberal and National Party, who opposed Medicare all the way, who opposed superannuation all the way at every stage, who said that they would destroy Medicare, and this now Prime Minister, who sat presumably up there somewhere as an opposition backbencher, who said superannuation was the biggest con job in Australian history. And now that he's the Prime Minister of Australia, uses it as an opportunity, uses his office as an opportunity to wreck superannuation, to stop an increase in the superannuation guarantee, to take away a tax concession from low-income workers. And in this week of all weeks, let's take a moment to think about what that means. Australia's low-income workers. 3.2 million Australians benefited from the low-income superannuation contribution. Two-thirds of them are women. Madam Speaker. And we know that on average, Australian females will retire with $92,000 less in their superannuation account, and we should do something about it as a parliament, as a nation, because Australian women deserve better. Those Australian women working hard right across the country, many of them here in this building, in factories and schools and workplaces right across the country, they deserve better than to retire with $92,000 less for their retirement in Australia. They deserve some help to save for their retirement through the low-income superannuation contribution. They deserve a bit of support from their government, not being arrogantly lectured that they're leaners when they are not, not being told that they are takers and not makers when they are not. They're not being told that Australia can't afford to keep them with a decent age pension, or that they should work until they're 70. They should work in the hospitals and the schools and the factories until they're 70, because they should not, Madam Speaker. They should be able to retire in dignity at a decent age, not the highest pension age in the developed world, which this Treasurer wants to give them. This government wants to give them, this Prime Minister wants to give them, and he lectures them about it. And he uses disgracefully this document. He disgracefully uses this document to sell his policies, to make Australians work longer than anybody else in the world and to give them an inadequate pension. What a disgrace. Well, there is a better way, Mr Deputy Speaker, than that. We can use the intergenerational report, have a proper conversation with the Australian people, and that will be the Labor way. When we're in office, we will keep the intergenerational report, but it will be prepared independently of government by the Parliamentary Budget Office, because that's what the Australian people deserve, a proper conversation. Because you know what? If we're in office, we won't hide from scrutiny, and we won't mind an independent conversation. And if we don't like what the Parliamentary Budget Office does, we won't try and seek to drive them out of office, which is what this government does with independent statutory office holders they don't like. That's what this government treats independent scrutiny. That's how this government handles public debate, bullies independent statutory office holders. Well, we'll have a different approach. We'll have a different approach. We'll have an approach which not only embraces an intergenerational report and a proper conversation about Australia's future and opportunities. We'll embrace an approach which invests in the future, which invests in Australian retirement incomes, which uses the great strength of the Australian financial system and our financial sector to give every working Australian a decent retirement, every working Australian a chance of a dignified retirement, regardless of whether they're a cleaner or a carpenter or a policeman or a bricklayer or a member of parliament. Every Australian deserves a dignified retirement. Every Australian deserves a chance to not be entirely reliant on the full-age pension. Our changes would have added $500 billion to Australia's retirement income system, and their changes taken away. And as they do so, they lecture the Australian people that they're not working hard enough, that they need to work longer, and that their age pension is too generous. Well, guess what? The age pension is not too generous, and Australians should not work longer than anybody else in the world, and it's only this government that thinks it.